Okay, Rabbi, welcome back. All right, so everybody, our minds are in Eretz Yisroel, so we decided this week to talk about the mitzvah of Yishuv Eretz Yisroel. We're going to try to keep this more halachic, less political, and let's get started. So, is it a mitzvah to live in Eretz Yisroel? Is it a mitzvah deraisa? Is it a mitzvah derabanan? Is it not a mitzvah at all? If it is a mitzvah, is it a mitzvah chiyuvis? Is it a mitzvah kiyumis? We'll discuss as we go. Okay, so there are two psukim in the Torah, one in Parshas Masay, one in Parshas Re'eh, that are very similar, almost the same pasuk, where it says that there's a mitzvah. It says telling Yeshua to conquer the land and to inherit the land and to live in the land of Eretz Yisroel. So what is going on when the Torah is telling Yeshua to conquer the land, to inherit the land, and to live in the land of Eretz Yisroel? There's three technical possibilities. One is that the Torah is just going through the technical process of what Yeshua is doing. That's not actually a mitzvah, but it's just these are the stages and the steps. So maybe. Second possibility is that it is a mitzvah. It's a commandment that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is commanding Yeshua. It's a one-off mitzvah for Yeshua at that time for you to go and live in Eretz Yisroel. After you finish your conquering, you shall live there. There's a third option, that it's a mitzvah of this Yishuv Eretz Yisroel. It's a mitzvah that's l'deiros. It was first said to Yeshua, that he was the first one to encounter the mitzvah, but once it is said, it is something that lasts and it's something forever. It's something for all of us. So let's find out what the Mefarshim say, what the Mishnayos say, what the Gemara says. So let's take a peek. So surprisingly, interestingly enough, there is no explicit Mishnah and there is no explicit Gemara discussing the chiyuv of Yishuv Eretz Yisroel. There's definitely Gemaras we're going to discuss where there may be rayas from the Gemaras, and there's definitely a lots of Agadata out there that discusses the many meilos of Eretz Yisroel and the positive elements and aspects of living in Eretz Yisroel, but they aren't seemingly halachic dika, or they're definitely at least not clearly halachic dika Gemaras. Okay. So where are we going to look? What are we going to see? So if you want to know if something's a mitzvah, always the first off, the classic place to go is Rambam Sefer HaMitzvos. So when we open up the Rambam Sefer HaMitzvos and we start looking for the mitzvah of Yishuv Eretz Yisroel, I know a lot of people are very disappointed when they don't find it. The Rambam does not bring as one of his 613 mitzvahs Yishuv Eretz Yisroel. The Hasagas HaRamban on the Rambam, where the Ramban, these are the places where he's arguing on the Rambam's count of mitzvahs, and he has a little bit of a different count. He was one of the, what we call the Moineh HaMitzvahs, the people that counted and tried to figure out which ones fit into the 613 mitzvahs. And the Ramban says that the Rambam left out Yishuv Eretz Yisroel. And there certainly is a mitzvah deraisa of Yishuv Eretz Yisroel. And just a little side point in the Ramban, because I thought it was very interesting. The Ramban actually breaks the mitzvah up into two halakim. There is what he calls Yeshivas Eretz Yisroel and Yishuv Eretz Yisroel. Yeshivas Eretz Yisroel is to actually live there, to go and make that the place of your primary residence. Yishuv Eretz Yisroel is the mitzvah of developing the land. So it's the way of whatever you need to do to make this Eretz Yisroel place more comfortable for people to live in, or higher quality of life, maybe more access for more people. So in some way, shape, or form to develop the land or to make parts of the land better, build a yeshiva there, I don't know, something of the sort. I know some people think about planting trees. I would rather build a yeshiva than plant a tree. So build a yeshiva in Eretz Yisroel, and that would be a form of Yishuv Eretz Yisroel. And Now, usually, when you say two sections of a mitzvah, zwei dinim, as they say, so usually that's a chiddush to break one mitzvah into two dinim. As I've heard many times from Rav Moshe Rabinowitz, tell me the name of the Brisker Rav, that when you have two psukim teaching you, two distinct psukim teaching you the same mitzvah, that is often an indication that there's going to be tzvei dinim. There's going to be two different chalakim of the mitzvah, or two different applications of that mitzvah. And it works very well, because why did the Torah need to teach us the same mitzvah in two separate psukim? There must be two different types of ways of fulfilling that same mitzvah. So that works very well. Now, what's pshat in the fact that the Rambam didn't list Yishuv Eretz Yisroel as one of the mitzvahs? So there's a couple of ways of explaining the Rambam. Now you might off the bat want to jump to the conclusion, wait, if the Rambam didn't list it as a mitzvah, that means he holds there's no such thing. But for those that are familiar with the concept of counting mitzvahs, really, in Yiddishkeit, there's way more than 613 things that we need to do and stop ourselves from doing. We have a lot more requirements than 613 requirements. The job of the Minei Mitzvahs, one of the jobs of the Minei Mitzvahs at least, was to figure out what could we categorize together and what is going to make the cut as a fulfilling the criteria of being considered a mitzvah. But really, often there's a lot more to it than just these 613 things. I think the Gra said there were thousands of different mitzvahs which were subcategories of the 613 mitzvahs. So, what's pshat in the Rambam? So, famously, the Megillas Esther, who was one of the mefarshim to explain the Rambam Sefer Mitzvahs, says you could see from the fact that the Rambam didn't list Yishuv Eretz Yisroel as a mitzvah, must be that the Rambam holds that it is not a mitzvah. So he takes that strong conclusion, Megillas Esther, that there is no mitzvah nowadays of Yishuv Eretz Yisroel.
It's not a mitzvah, it's not a shiur.
No, not even a mitzvah. Once again, he's healed. The Megillas Esther says nowadays it's not a mitzvah. It's only a mitzvah bisman shebeis hamikdash kayim. When the Beis Hamikdash was around, then there was a mitzvah of Yishuv Eretz Yisroel. Zot the Megillas Esther. Nowadays, there is no mitzvah of Yishuv Eretz Yisroel. The Avnei Nezer, he has a different view of the Rambam. The Avnei Nezer wants to suggest that the mitzvah of Yishuv Eretz Yisroel is a subcategory, and it is included within the mitzvah of Kivush Eretz Yisroel. Because one of the mitzvahs that the Rambam does list is the conquering of Eretz Yisroel. So Zot the Avnei Nezer, what's the whole point of conquering Eretz Yisroel? You're not meant to conquer it to leave it barren. You're meant to conquer Eretz Yisroel in order to live in Eretz Yisroel. And therefore, Yishuv Eretz Yisroel is included within the mitzvah of Kivush Eretz Yisroel. And therefore, that's what the Avnei Nezer wants to suggest is part of the mitzvah. And he brings a precedence that we know that the Rambam lists as one of his mitzvahs is binyan Beis HaMikdash, but the Rambam doesn't list building the kelim of the Beis HaMikdash. Well, surely building the kelim of the Beis HaMikdash, you would assume that would be a mitzvah. But how everybody explains the Rambam, that building the kelim of the Beis HaMikdash is a subcategory, so to speak, of building the Beis HaMikdash. When you have the mitzvah of building the Beis HaMikdash, that includes the building the kelim. Whereas the Ramban actually treats that as two separate, distinct mitzvahs. So it works very well that in these type of categorical mitzvahs, such as building the Beis HaMikdash or being Kivush Eretz Yisroel, that the Rambam counts it as one mitzvah, whereas the Ramban counts it as two mitzvahs. And therefore, that's what the Avnei Nezer uses to back up his suggestion that the Rambam holds that Yishuv Eretz Yisroel is a subcategory of Kivush Eretz Yisroel. I heard from Rav Asher Weiss that he wanted to challenge, so to speak, the Avnei Nezer's raya, and he wanted to say that it's totally different. Because when it comes to Binyan Beis HaMikdash and the Kalim of the Beis HaMikdash, it's very likely and understandable to say that the Rambam only listed building the Beis HaMikdash and assumed that the Kalim, which is relatively tuffle, secondary to the building of the Beis HaMikdash, so we only need to do the Iker and not the tuffle, and the tuffle's included. However, you can't suggest that Yishuv Eretz Yisroel is a tuffle to Kivush Eretz Yisroel. Surely, if anything's the Iker is going to be the Yishuv Eretz Yisroel, not the Kivush. The Kivush is to serve the Yishuv. The Yishuv isn't for the Kivush. So therefore, Rav Asher Weiss wanted to challenge the Raya of the Avnei Nezer. I want to actually defend the Avnei Nezer against the Kasha of Rav Asher Weiss. And I want to suggest that perhaps the derech of the Rambam is to list the one that's first, chronologically. Meaning, yes, he only listed the Binyan Beis HaMikdash because you first build the Beis HaMikdash, and then you build the Kalim. But, so he lists the building of the Beis HaMikdash. And when it came to the Kivush, you first conquer Eretz Yisrael, and then you live in Eretz Yisrael. So therefore, when he's going to list these categorical mitzvahs, he'll do the first one. Maybe he won't do the Iker, but he'll do the first one. But I don't have enough Rambam knowledge to tell you that there might be kashas on me from other places. If there are,
The Mishkan, they built the Kalim first, then the Mishkan.
They were commanded to, but they didn't. That was the whole thing that B'tzalel and his Chachma understood. Even though the command was to first build the Kalim and then the Mishkan, he knew in his Chachma to actually build the Mishkan and then the Kalim. B'tzalel Kel. Yeah? Fine. So, okay. So, that's a potential possibility. That's how the Avnei Nezer explains the Rambam. Rav Asher Weiss wasn't satisfied with the Avnei Nezer's proof. He wanted to suggest that the concept of Yishuv Eretz Yisroel might not be a mefurish, according to the Rambam, it might not be mefurish mitzvah, but it's still a din deraisa. It's a din deraisa under a category that he categorized as Ratzon Hashem. You could clearly see from the fact that HaKadosh Baruch Hu told Avram Avinu, your children will get Eretz Yisroel, and Yitzchak, your children will get Eretz Yisroel, Yaakov, your children will get Eretz Yisroel, and all the Haftachas and all the Chazal that speak about the Meilus of Eretz Yisroel. It's a clear indication that you see Ratzon Hashem, deraisa dika Ratzon Hashem, is for us, for the Yidden, to go to Eretz Yisroel. And it's a deraisa dika concept, but it doesn't actually qualify as a pure mitzvah. So that was the suggestion of Rav Asher Weiss. There's also the Rashbash, which was a late Rishon, that says that maybe the Rambam held that the mitzvah is only derabanan. It's a derabanan dika mitzvah of Yishuv Eretz Yisroel, and therefore it wasn't included. The Moshe Feinstein has a fascinating argument where he says there's no way that there could be a din derabanan of Yishuv Eretz Yisroel. It's either deraisa or there's no such mitzvah. Why? Why can't there be a derabanan? Because we have a concept in a mitzvah derabanan, which is another names for a mitzvah derabanan, is kind of a gezerah. So if there's a gezerah that the tzibur cannot handle, the gezerah doesn't take effect. Or if the gezerah that the tzibur never took upon themselves, it doesn't take effect. And we have a very classic example when it comes to pas palter. Chazal originally asered all the bread of goyim, but there were certain places where they didn't have a Jewish bakery. And if you don't have a Jewish bakery and we aser all the bread of the goyim, then people were going to starve. They couldn't handle it. And therefore, eating the bread of the professional baker, the palter, was never accepted by Klal Yisrael, and therefore it's still allowed to eat pas palter. There might be a chumrah of not eating it, and a chinami. But the ikar din was that you are allowed to eat pas palter, because that gezerah was never chal, because it was too hard for the tzibur. So after Moshe Feinstein, it's clear in history, it was too hard for the tzibur to move to Eretz Yisrael. Throughout the majority of our generations, it was too difficult for most of the world to move to Eretz Yisrael. So you see, they didn't shteltzu, they didn't keep up with that gezerah, that din derabanan, and therefore, if it was a din derabanan, it wouldn't be applicable nowadays. It would just have not counted. So it's either deraisa or nothing. Okay, there's a Tosfos in Ksubis dealing with why is it that if it's a mitzvah, why have we not gone in mass to Eretz Yisrael over the generations? Huh? You got it. Kuf Yud is actually the Tosfos, but it's that sugya. Very good. So Tosfos explains that the reason that he suggests the reason that we haven't gone to Eretz Yisrael en masse, two answers. The first answer is because it was dangerous. And if it's dangerous, if it's Pekuach Nefesh, he was more referring about the travel, seemingly, than being there. Not that being there wasn't dangerous, I have no idea. But he seems to have been referring to the travel was dangerous. And therefore, if it's Pekuach Nefesh, you don't have to do a mitzvah if it's Pekuach Nefesh, if it's not one of the Gimel Mitzvahs Chamuris. He also quotes Rabbeinu Chaim, which is not your usual quote in Tosfos. He quotes Rabbeinu Chaim, who says that the reason that we don't go to Eretz Yisrael is because since the mitzvahs are difficult to keep, and since the mitzvahs are the mitzvahs tluis ba'aretz seemingly of Shemitah and Trumas and Meisers, I guess, since the mitzvahs are difficult to keep, therefore we don't go there. So that actually, to me, that sounded very strange. That's not how we usually live our lives. You have a mitzvah opportunity and you don't go because there's a chance of not being successful. So the Marit actually says that this quote of Rabbeinu Chaim makes no sense. And it must be a misprint. Perhaps it was put in by a Talmud or something like that, and it must be a misprint. The Tzitz Eliezer, goes with this as well, and he says it doesn't make any sense. It must be a misprint. Rav Shlomo Zalman writes, nowadays, in 1968, it's no longer hard to keep the mitzvahs tluis ba'aretz in Eretz Yisrael. And by the way, Shemitah was quite a challenge in 1968. But nowadays, we could keep the halachas in Eretz Yisrael. It's not hard anymore, and therefore, even Rabbeinu Chaim would agree that you should come to Eretz Yisrael nowadays. So that's what Shlomo Zalman wrote in 1968. I think now, 55 years later, I think it's quite clear that we have hashkachas that take care of all the complicated things for you. It's not a big deal. Okay. The Chayei Adam says, coming to Eretz Yisrael demands a higher level of avodas Hashem. So what's implied in the Chayei Adam is it's better for we'll call somebody who's not shomer Torah mitzvahs, it's better for them not to come to Eretz Yisrael. Because to come to Eretz Yisrael, you need to have a high level of avodas Hashem. I was just thinking as a side point, I'm going to leave it as tzarachin, but let's say you have somebody who's not from Fry. Should you advise them to come to Eretz Yisrael or not? So from this Chayei Adam, it's seemingly you should not advise them to come to Eretz Yisrael. The only thing is another factor that's often the case, that if they come to Eretz Yisrael, they're statistically going to marry a Jew. If they stay in Chutz La'aretz, they might end up marrying a guy. So what are you better off doing with this person? Something to think about. Okay, so now, back to Ksubis. So now Ksubis, we're going a bit further, we're on Kuf Yud Aleph now. So the Gemara brings down, on the top of Kuf Yud Aleph, Amud Aleph, that there were 3 shvuos made. The first shvua was made by Klal Yisrael, that we won't take Eretz Yisrael by force. We won't break down the walls. We won't take Eretz Yisrael by force. The second shvua is we won't rebel against the Goyim. And the third shvua, which HaKadosh Baruch Hu put on the Goyim, so the Goyim kind of made the shvua, or Hashem made the Goyim make the shvua, is that they will not oppress the Yidden too much, too badly. So, wait a second. can't take Eretz Yisrael by force. A lot of wars going on, so perhaps living here is actually an Aveira, not a mitzvah. Because if we had a shvua that said we can't take Eretz Yisrael by force, and there's been force around, we'll investigate that in a minute, then maybe it's a Aveira to live here. And I've heard, I didn't find it inside, but I've heard quoted that was the shita of the Satmarov. That the Satmarov held that you broke you're here via breaking the shvua, you're here via Aveira, you can't call that a mitzvah. It's no longer a mitzvah to be in Eretz Yisrael.
Seven shuas.
Huh?
The shuas, I think that's his part.
Yeah. So that is, once again, I heard that b'shem the Satmarov. I didn't find it inside, but I think it's pretty Yedua quoted in his name. Okay. Now, without getting too political, is there a response to the Satmarov's taina? Is it possible that did that just kill the mitzvah of Yishuv Eretz Yisroel for all of us? So, it's a little technical, but let's try. Simply speaking, you could argue that Eretz Yisroel wasn't taken by force. Rather, what happened is in 1947-48, the Roiv of the nations of the world gave Eretz Yisroel to the Jewish people. It wasn't taken by force. It was given. Then what happened is that the Arab nations waged a war on the Jewish people. And nobody's arguing that we were allowed to defend ourselves once a war was placed upon us. So if we present the scenario as I just did, then perhaps there was no force. We were given it by the consensus of the nations. And if we were given the land by the consensus of the nations and they fought us, so that is not considered rebelling and that is not considered taking it by force. The reason why it is not so clear what I'm suggesting is because the Arabs who were locally on the land, they were not maskim to this consensus of the nations. So since they were not maskim to the consensus of the nations, it's not clear that that is considered not taking it by force. Even though the Jews didn't start a war against them, but perhaps the Jews, immigrating onto the land when the Arabs weren't so happy about it, one could argue that is considered force. I would say the Pashas is it's not considered taking by force, and therefore it's not breaking the shvua. I heard from Russia Weiss that's how he views it. But I think a lot of it depends on how you understand the history. It kind of depends on what's your news source. If you're going to check Fox News, then what I said makes perfect sense. If you're going to look at Al Jazeera or whatever it's called, then you might see a different story. And what I said didn't make sense. So it's a little bit dependent on where you get your information from as to how you're going to understand the history of this issue. Now, I heard that the Stipler held that we did break the shvua. Meaning, I don't know who the we is, but whoever started the Medina did break the shvua and did go against the Gemara. However, the Stipler says, okay, so what they did was wrong. That was Avera. But why shouldn't we, at this point, go and enjoy the mitzvah of Yishuv Eretz Yisroel? One is not connected to the other. They did Avera. We'll do Yishuv Eretz Yisroel, and it's not a stira. Now, some want to argue. I don't remember who this is because I didn't find it this time, but it's tucked in my memory from learning through this a different time. That since the Goyim didn't keep their end of the shvua, they didn't not oppress us too much. In fact, they oppressed us a ton. Therefore, we are not bound by our side of the shvua. And therefore the shvua doesn't apply anymore. It was batal. It was supposed to be, so to speak, a deal. They didn't keep their end of the deal, so we don't have to keep our end of the deal. And therefore, it is no Avera, even if we would have taken Eretz Yisrael by force. I was thinking with this that in a hashkafic standpoint, it would be very good Because when we had the greatest oppression, the greatest breaking of the Goyim Shvuah in the Holocaust, pretty much in the couple years after the aftermath of the Holocaust, I'm not saying this was the kavanah of the people that founded, part of the kavanah of the people that founded Israel, part of the kavanah was we need safety after the Holocaust, but I'm not really coming from their kavanahs. I'm coming from the hashkacha of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, when it was clear that the Goyim weren't keeping their end of their Shvuah. Now it was time for the Yidden to not need to keep their side of the Shvuah of not taking over Eretz Yisrael. So I was thinking that would be an interesting thought. Okay. Now, the Rashbash and the Kafta V'Perach explain that Shvuah is an Isser in the Tzibur. That the Tzibur is not allowed to take over Eretz Yisrael. Yishuv Eretz Yisrael is a mitzvah in the Yachid. So the Isser and the Tzibur cannot get in the way of the mitzvah of the Yachid. So the Tzibur is not supposed to take over Eretz Yisrael. The Yachid is supposed to come and try to live here. And the Stipler might be based on that. One thing that I forgot to throw out earlier, the Sefer Hasidim says it's a mitzvah gedola to live in Eretz Yisrael. Okay. There's a Mishnah in Kesubis that says Hakol Mailin L'Eretz Yisrael. And therefore a husband can force a wife to move to Eretz Yisrael. And if she refuses, he could divorce her without her getting her ksuba. And a wife could force the husband to come to Eretz Yisrael. And if he refuses, she could demand a get, and Beis Din will force him to give a get. So we see this concept of that we could force the spouse to go to Eretz Yisrael. Zak the Tzitz Eliezer, if you could force your spouse to come to Eretz Yisrael, that is a raya. It must be a mitzvah deraisa to come to Eretz Yisrael. Because there's no way you would be allowed to force your spouse to do it if it wasn't a mitzvah deraisa. There's a Gemara in Gittin, Chasam and Aleph, that says that one is allowed to do a mir la'akum, to tell a goy to sign a contract for you on Shabbos to purchase land in Eretz Yisrael, to purchase land from a goy. If a Jew is purchasing land from a goy in Eretz Yisrael, you can tell the goy on Shabbos to go and sign the document for me. We see for this, we usually don't see this, that you could just go and Amir La'akam for all your good deeds. So Rav Asher Weiss wanted to say, from the fact that this is the mitzvah that you're allowed to do Amir La'akam on Shabbos for, it must be a mitzvah deraisa. There's no way in Svara to say for all the mitzvahs deraisas, no, you can't use Amir La'akam, but for mitzvah derabanan you could. Doesn't make sense. So it must be that it's a mitzvah deraisa. So to sum up the shitas right now quickly as to whether it's a mitzvah deraisa, mitzvah derabanan, not a mitzvah at all. So to sum that up so far, we have the Satmar Rebbe. According to the Satmar Rebbe, it's not a mitzvah at all. We have the living here is not an isser. The people that conquered is an isser. To live here is not an isser and not a mitzvah. We have the Rabbeinu Chaim. According to him, there's no mitzvah, seemingly. But, once again, Shlomo Zalman said, nowadays even Rabbeinu Chaim would admit it is a mitzvah. And once again, we don't have the dangerous to come to Eretz Yisrael. It's not applicable nowadays. Now, according to the Ramban, it's a mitzvah deraisa. The Tzitz Eliezer and Rav Asher Weiss, they have Gemaras that back up this Ramban. According to the Rambam, so the Rambam doesn't list it as a mitzvah, and therefore there's different pirushim on it. The Megillas Esther says it's not a mitzvah at all, and the Avnei Nezer says it's a mitzvah deraisa, and Rav Asher Weiss says it's Ratzon Hashem deraisa in the Rambam. To note, the Rambam himself says, based on that same basic Gemara in Kesubos, that it's better for somebody to live in a city that's Rubay Ovid Kechavim, mostly idol worshippers in Eretz Yisrael, than to live in a city that's Rubay Yehudim, mostly Jews in Chutz La'aretz. So whether he held it was a pure mitzvah or not a pure mitzvah, it's quite clear he held it's of extreme importance to to live in Eretz Yisroel. Now, the Sifri, also to point out, the Sifri says, I wanted to find this inside, I didn't know where to look for it, but I heard it quoted, that the Sifri says that doing mitzvahs in Chutz La'aretz are just there to remember how to do mitzvahs in Eretz Yisrael. The ikar of everything is mitzvahs in Eretz Yisrael, it's just practice. All mitzvahs in Chutz La'aretz. I thought that was like a wild chiddush. I wanted to find it inside, I didn't find it. Okay, now, Reb Moshe is mechadish that it's not a mitzvah chiyuvis, like wearing tefillin. You don't decide, today I'm not in the mood of wearing tefillin. No, it's a mitzvah chiyuvis. You have a chiyuv of wearing tefillin. So Dr. Moshe, it's not a mitzvah chiyuvis, rather it's a mitzvah kiyumis, like wearing tzitzis. If you want to put on a pair of tzitzis, you put on a pair of tzitzis and you get a mitzvah. If you don't want to put on a pair of tzitzis, so you don't, and you don't get the mitzvah. If you want to eat matzah outside of the Seder, the rest of the days of Pesach, the third day of Pesach, you want to eat matzah. You eat matzah, you get a mitzvah. You don't eat matzah, you don't get a mitzvah. Nobody's forcing you. So Dr. Moshe, you want to live in Eretz Yisrael, you get a mitzvah. You don't want to live in Eretz Yisrael, you don't have to. And that is how Moshe Feinstein learns. Okay, so how do we paskin? So the Chafetz Chaim followed the Ramban, seemingly that it's a chiyuv. The Gra followed the Ramban, that seemingly it's a chiyuv, as did Rav Yashiv, Rav Shlomo Zalman, Rav Chaim Kanievsky, and the Tzitz Eliezer. They all learned that it's seemingly a chiyuv deraisa to live in Eretz Yisrael. But Rav Moshe, as we said it was a mitzvah kiyumis. Now, a basic question, Jewish history question. I don't know what percentage of this question is understanding history and what percentage of this question is a pure halachical question. But if it is, according to most poskim, a chiyuv to live in Eretz Yisrael, so why in the world, over the generations, has the high majority of Klal Yisrael not lived in Eretz Yisrael? This is a very recent phenomenon that we're talking in the last 30 years, 20 years, that you have a high percentage of Klal Yisrael in Eretz Yisrael. This is new stuff. So why is that? So the Avnei Nezer explains, and in this pshat I like the way that I heard of Usher Weiss explain it. If you know a little bit about the Avnei Nezer was arguably the greatest posek of Poland. He wrote the Avnei Nezer. He also wrote the Iglei Tal, which is a very important sefer in Hilchos Shabbos. But some people wear two hats. He had a hat and a shtreimel, because he wasn't only the Avnei Nezer and the Iglei Tal, he was also the Sakhachev Rebbe. And this answer that he's going to explain sounds like he took off his Avnei Nezer hat and he put on his Sakhachev Rebbe shtreimel to give this answer. He says they didn't come to Eretz Yisrael because the tzinuros of Shefa weren't in Eretz Yisrael, and the Shefa of Parnasa, etc., wasn't coming down in Eretz Yisrael, and that's why the people didn't come. Okay, it doesn't sound like a very Avnei Nezer halachic answer, but that's how he explains. Now, we already see from Tosfos that there was a reason that it was dangerous. So that seems to be was true at the time of Tosfos. I'm sure it was true at other times as well. And once you say that it's dangerous, this is not one of the mitzvahs that you do pikuach nefesh for. The Trumas Hadeshin, which I think was approximately 400 years ago, I believe. So he says that people didn't go to Eretz Yisrael because there was major parnasa problems. There was issues with missionaries, which I think makes sense. A lot of people don't realize. In Yerushalayim, there are tons of these churches that were built around 400 years ago or so. So I guess when these churches were all getting built, there were probably lots of missionaries around, I guess. And furthermore, the Trumas Hadeshin says that the other problem with what did he write? Yeah, and Arab problems. That was the other thing, right? There were problems with Arabs. There was danger problems with Arabs. And therefore, based on all these problems, they didn't come to Eretz Yisrael. which is a little monkey wrench on those that claim that it was always peaceful coexistence with the Arabs, because the Trumas Hadeshin lists it as the reason why people didn't go to Eretz Yisrael. So I don't know. Maybe there were different kufas. Okay. Now it's interesting to note that even the Ramban is the one who champions the idea of it being a mitzvah deraisa to live in Eretz Yisrael. And where did the Ramban live most of his days? The Ramban lived most of his life in Chutz La'aretz. So what's going on? The one who says the mitzvah deraisa doesn't even come. So there's two, and he didn't come until the end of his life. There's two probable explanations. Either because it was very dangerous to come, and therefore he didn't come, or because he was the Rav of a community, the tzibur needed him. If the tzibur needed him, he couldn't come. Until when he was older, there's a famous debate that the Ramban was in, where he debated some yid who went off the derech. So the Ramban debated him in front of the king, and the king famously told the Ramban, "I never heard somebody do such a good job defending lies." That was the compliment of the king, because it was a foregone conclusion before the debate started that the Ramban was going to lose. So the Ramban, to save his life, had to run away. So if it was B'kuch Nefesh to stay, and the B'kuch Nefesh to go to Eretz Yisrael, he decided I might as well just do the B'kuch Nefesh and go to Eretz Yisrael. So he took off and went to Eretz Yisrael. It's also interesting to note that the Gra, who paskins like the Ramban, that's a chiyuv to live in Eretz Yisrael, he never made it to Eretz Yisrael. He never came to Eretz Yisrael. Now they do say that the Gra actually left Vilna to come to Eretz Yisrael. And it's unclear what exactly happened along the way. Something happened. He didn't make it to Eretz Yisrael, and he turned around and came back to Vilna. But the Roiv of the Talmidei HaGra, the Gra's Talmidim, did end up going to Eretz Yisrael. So that's interesting. Something fascinating is that apparently the Talmidei HaGra claimed that the Gra was a Gilgal of Moshe Rabbeinu. And therefore, just like Moshe Rabbeinu couldn't make it into Eretz Yisrael as much as he tried, so too the Gra couldn't make it into Eretz Yisrael as much as he tried. Interesting. I'm not such a big Gilgal guy, but I do find that interesting. Okay. Now, Samaisa, why didn't everybody go? Outside of these Gedolim, why didn't everybody go? So Rav Asher Weiss had a very interesting explanation, and he wants to say like this. When it comes to performing a mitzvah, there's only so much money one has to pay, up to a sixth of his possessions. And when it comes to mitzvahs, there's certain amounts of gvulim on effort. What effort and time that one has to put in. Let's say somebody needs to wash his hands for bread. So, we know the shiur, 18 minutes out of the way, 72 minutes in the way, or you call 1 mil out of the way, 1 parsa on the way. If there's, you have to wait that long. If not, you could just eat your bread. So we see that HaKadosh Baruch Hu only expects people to go to a certain degree of pain to perform the mitzvahs. And therefore, Zakt Rav Asher Weiss, to go to Eretz Yisrael 500 years ago, it was tremendously difficult. It was super difficult. Financially, extremely complicated. There was no industry in Eretz Yisrael. The cost of getting there was a fortune. And when you get there, it was a very difficult, hard life. And on top of that, they didn't have phones back then. So when you move, you're cutting yourself socially, you're cutting yourself off from everything you knew till then. To go through such a great hassle, the Torah was never mechayev anybody to go through such a hassle like that. There were individual yichidei skula that went to move up. But as Klal Yisrael as a whole, there would never be such a chiyuv. Now, nowadays, it's a lot easier. It's definitely a lot easier. Now, is there a heter not to live in Eretz Yisrael nowadays? Or does everybody have to live in Eretz Yisrael? So once again, according to the Satmar Rebbe, sure there's a heter not to live in Eretz Yisrael. According to Moshe Feinstein, yeah, you don't have to do it. It's a mitzvah kiyamus. According to most poskim, so let's start investigating. Is there a sakana nowadays to come to Eretz Yisrael? No. Even if you want to tie it's a little bit more dangerous or whatever, I'm sure there's people that debate this back and forth. But even if you're going to suggest that, it's definitely not dangerous to the degree of sakana. We wouldn't label that as sakana, for sure not. Now, okay, so that didn't work. What about parnasa? So, I mean, I think there is parnasa available in Eretz Yisrael. I am masking that it's easier. There's a lot more parnasa to be had in Chutz La'aretz, so to speak. But I think there is parnasa in Eretz Yisrael. And furthermore, people certainly have to, live on lower. People could live on lower budgets in Eretz Yisrael than in America. So I don't know. I think people could work this one out. Obviously, it depends on somebody's industry. But you know what? L'maisa, it's still a very difficult thing moving to Eretz Yisrael, even though it's much easier than it used to be. Nobody could argue that going halfway across the world, you're certainly cutting a lot of your social ties. And going to a world that you're less used to. And going to a world that you don't know how things run so well. I think we all have to agree that's considered very difficult. And therefore we can't say that people have an absolute chiyuv to move to Eretz Yisrael. We could say they have mitzvah, but we can't say that they have a chiyuv. And one thing that I want to put out there is, I think we at least should highlight the fact that each individual should at least think of the idea of whether or not it's the right thing for him to move to Eretz Yisrael. Thank you for listening, and we should hear only good news from Eretz Yisrael.